Okay. Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnen. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension, Wisconsin 4-H, and on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce my nephew, Jack Zinnen. He's with the Illinois Natural History Survey, which is part of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's going to speak with us about the biodiversity of the Midwestern commercial plant trade. Jack, I get to ask you the same 5 questions I ask everybody. As you know from earlier today, the rules are you can answer in any way that you want. Doesn't have to be true, just has to be believable. Jack, where were you born?
Hinsdale, Illinois, even though that really seems like a technicality to me, yeah, because I'm from Springfield, Illinois. Is that question too? Is that right?
Yes, but
yeah.
Thanks for leaping ahead.
Yes.
Way to go.
Yeah.
Jack, where'd you go to high school?
I went to Springfield High School.
Oh, here we go. We have a theme established now.
Yes.
And Jack, where'd you go for your undergrad and what did you study?
I studied biology at the University of Illinois at Springfield.
And then where'd you get your PhD?
I got my doctorate last year at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences, which is kind of a catch-all department for anything related to the environment or nature or ecology, such as in my case.
Excellent. And then when did you start working for the Illinois Natural History Survey?
I defended in June my dissertation, and then I got my job in August of last year, and I am an assistant research scientist, and specifically I work in wetland delineation and wetland ecology in the Wetlands Working Group. So we're a group of scientists who survey wetland habitats and do science on the side.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to your talk. Would you please join me in welcoming Jack
Hello.
Zinnen to Wednesday Night at the Lab. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Jack Zinnen, and thank you for being here. This is on, I sound okay? Great. Yeah, we'll be talking about the biodiversity of the Midwestern commercial plant trade. So let's get started. Well, first, just a basic roadmap of the topics we're going to be covering tonight. We'll first discuss the environmental context of the American Midwest. I feel very local in my research. I was born in Illinois. I grew up in central Illinois, and that's kind of shaped what I want to research and my interests, which we'll talk about. Then we'll talk about the demand for native plants, as well as ecological restoration in the region. We'll be discussing and taking a deep dive into the different types of plant vendors in the Midwest. We'll discuss plant materials, and then finally, we'll look at some of the nuances of native plant species availability. So before I got started, I just wanted to give a quick introduction about myself. There I am right here, about 12 or 13 years old, so I think this was probably around 2005. I actually became interested in this topic, and I developed my passion for biology as well as botany because when I was a young kid, I worked or volunteered for a small native plant nursery outside of Springfield, Illinois. And there I noticed that native plants were really interesting, and I also noticed that I didn't see them around in the landscape. And so there I developed an appreciation for native plants, and it was kind of a nice nursery, no pun intended, for ecology. And just as a quick aside, I don't mean to ramble on about myself, but at my job now, we go survey wetlands that are often created from the Illinois Department of Transportation. And at this nursery, we were growing wetland plants to sell to restorations just like that. So I think it's actually quite poetic that I started here, and here I am with a PhD still studying this stuff. So now let's talk about kind of the sad context of the American Midwest. The Midwest is a highly impacted region, perhaps or arguably one of the most highly impacted regions in the world. This is because the vast majority of natural areas in the region have been converted to mostly agricultural or urban land uses. That primarily started in the 19th century in pretty severe scenarios. And the existing or remaining natural areas, after a lot of that was destroyed by Europeans moving in, a lot of those existing ecosystems that hung on have since degraded substantially. And so now the American Midwest, as I'm sure many are familiar, and it's especially true in central Illinois, is called kind of an ecological desert, a sea of corn and soy and low biodiversity agriculture. And because of this, most native plant species, they're not necessarily endangered in the classic sense. They're not going to be wiped off the face of the planet forever, and we will never see them again, but they are rare in a sense, right? Many native plant species out on the landscape you can't find easily unless you know where to go looking or what protected preserves still have them. So because of all these contexts, the Midwest has some kind of severe biodiversity issues with respect to plants. And for this slide, I just wanted to briefly overview the different types of plant communities or plant ecosystems that are pretty substantial in the Midwest. There are 3 major ones, and keep in mind that they do intergrade substantially. So in the Midwest, especially in kind of the northern half of Wisconsin, you have woodland habitats, you have woodland communities. This forest in this picture is actually a fen technically, so it is also a wetland. Like I said, they can kind of intergrade. Then you have wetland ecosystems, which are a relatively small portion of the landscape, but are quite important for plant biodiversity. And then lastly, kind of true to my heart, and what really got me interested in this topic, are prairie plants, which are beloved for their showiness, and prairies are loved for their biodiversity. And a quick fact about prairies is that they're actually one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the world. In fact, the most biodiverse ecosystem in the world at small scales. So everyone thinks of tropical rainforests as being the most biodiverse, and that is true at a big scale, but at a small scale, at the meter level, is actually tallgrass prairie ecosystems. Unfortunately, for all of these types of communities, particularly for prairies, many have been destroyed, and much of the best farmland that we see in the landscape generally used to be some type of prairie community or was a drained and converted wetland. So just consider that when we're going through the rest of this talk, that we're talking about the entire breadth of the Midwest, though I do have kind of an affinity for prairie ecosystems. So because of this context, we have these wonderful biodiverse ecosystems in the Midwest, and we have this history of very severe destruction, particularly because the Midwest was developed and settled before conservation was really an idea or a thing. So I call this restoration to the rescue, kind of. And the practice of ecological restoration, it seeks to facilitate the recovery of degraded ecosystems, often to recreate some type of historical reference community. So this would be a prairie restoration that was in a former crop field. So you have a degraded environment and you're transforming it into something better. The practice of ecological restoration emerged right here. It's actually quite a local concept, and it actually emerged at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. That was like the world's first restoration for biodiversity's sake. So restoration kind of restores or promotes these ecosystems that have done very poorly, but I say restoration to the rescue kind of because restoring the full breadth of biodiversity that used to be here is very, very difficult, and it requires a lot of material inputs, which will come back later in the talk. And because of the context of the American Midwest, that all of these plant species are so rare on the landscape now, one might even consider restoration this form of plant conservation. It's a way to create more habitat for these now very rare plant species. So let's consider the range of ecological restoration or conservation activities. They vary greatly in size and scope. Many restorations in the Midwest are on the size of acres, and I call these sizable restorations. So here's just a quick picture of what that might look like. Many of the ecological restorations in the region are in former agricultural areas, and they are often associated with government subsidized projects, specifically the Conservation Reserve Program, if anybody has ever heard of that. That is a program to convert former agriculture into things like prairie. There are also smaller examples of restoration as a concept, and this even includes things like backyard gardening, so planting pollinator pockets in your backyard of native plant species to promote pollinators and other critters and insects. So collectively, what do these things that we learn mean? We know that the Midwest is highly impacted, that there are few remaining natural areas where these native plants persist, and we know that there's this demand for native plant species, particularly for ecological restoration or small backyard plantings and so on. Because of this, the commercial plant trade is critical to promoting plant biodiversity and ecological restoration in the region. For many plant species, consider, and especially consider from me as a native, a resident of central Illinois, many plant species, you can't just go find them somewhere. You may have to go very far away, or you may have to illegally dig them up in a nature preserve if you want them, which I don't advocate for that. So the alternative is you can purchase them commercially. So that is why we are talking about this today, and that is why this is an emerging topic in environmental sciences, and it's important to understand. So now we are interested in characterizing the commercial plant trade with respect to native plant biodiversity. So let's ask our driving questions. What are the types of plant vendors in the Midwest? How do these plant vendors vary in their biodiversity? For the third question, very simple, how many plant species are commercially available in the first place? And fourth, which of the species that are available are the most commercially popular? And lastly, what are some of the characteristics associated with commercial availability? So now we have these questions, and because I'm overviewing a couple of interrelated projects, we need to first define my parameters for how I went about these questions scientifically. I first need to define a region and kind of understand all the plant species that could theoretically be available or found in the Midwest. So my study region is what I call the core Midwest. I'll show it in the next slide. It consists of 7 study states that overlap very closely to the tallgrass prairie region, or in other words, it's kind of like the Corn Belt. That's essentially where my study region is. Then I need to understand what species, what plants used to be found in this entire region. So I combined state floras of all 7 of those study states, and I created something called a regional species pool. And a regional species pool is all the plant biodiversity, everything that could theoretically be found in the wild in any part of the Midwest. So consider all these different plant species, all the varieties of ecologies and growth forms and appearances and so on. We're interested in looking at everything. And this yields about 2,900 species being native to the Midwest. So that is a number that will come back later and is important when we are answering some of these driving questions. So now I have species that are found in the Midwest, and I have a study region. So now I actually need to sample the commercial plant trade. So what I did during COVID, when people were all stuck inside, was I sampled over 2,000 plant vendors throughout the Midwest. I looked at nursery listings that I found online, and I basically screened every single business that I could find that sold some type of plant material. I ended up getting data for 557 of these vendors that had some type of catalog or listing of the plant species that they were selling. In other words, lists that had some detail as to what the species actually were. And then I recorded all of the native species that were sold using that list of 2,900 to define what is native and what is not. And here to the left, we have our study region. As I said, it's kind of the core Midwest, overlapping with much of the Prairie Peninsula region. And each dot is a sample vendor, and we can see a concentration of data points of plant vendors in big cities, and especially in the Great Lakes area. So these are the vendors that were sampled. Keep in mind that there are many more out there that I did not get to sample because many vendors don't keep lists or records or didn't want to share them with me, which, yeah, I understand. A quick note on data collection. This is really important, and it may come up during questions. But my data that I recorded is for unaltered native plant materials, and I italicize that. Unaltered, you may think of meaning the wild form of the plant, the uncultivated form. In the commercial plant trade, many native plant species are converted into cultivars. These are plants that are generally really genetically limited. Sometimes they're even just clones of each other. And they tend to have these really weird, showy characteristics that local gardeners or people in their backyard might want to see. So here we just have two examples of this. This is purple coneflower, a beloved prairie plant, one of the most popular native plants that's sold in the landscape. And then we have black-eyed Susans, same exact story. Here are two cultivar or nativar versions of these plant species. And you can see that the physical appearance is quite different in both situations, and they are cultivated or artificially selected for these really weird traits. I did not record cultivars, and I did that for two reasons. One is that the biodiversity value of cultivars is probably more limited on average than the wild form, and that is especially true for people interested in ecological restoration and genetic diversity, right? Because these are often highly inbred or clones. And secondly, it's more of a pragmatic thing, that plant species available as cultivars are almost always universally available as their wild form. So keep in mind that this data is for what I call unaltered materials. So now let's talk about part one, plant vendors and native biodiversity. After sampling the 557 vendors, I assigned 4 emergent classifications to each of the plant vendors. Each classification represents a group of related plant vendors that have like a distinctive intended market and business model. And in addition to that, distinctive types of plants that they're selling. We're going to be discussing 4. The 4 types of vendors that I classified were general nurseries and garden centers, 2 tree farms, 3, and most importantly, native plant nurseries, and 4 others. So now, of these 4, let's take a deeper dive to understand what these are. General nurseries and garden centers. These are retail and wholesale vendors that sell a wide variety of plant materials. Their sales are typically geared towards like landscaping in yards or in some type of commercial setting or just simply selling stuff for yard work. And because of this, many of them also sell things that aren't plants, things like mulch or rock or even little garden trinkets, right? Many of these general nurseries and garden centers incidentally carry native plants. And I say incidental because they're not interested in promoting plant biodiversity necessarily. They're just trying to sell things that the public wants. And that will come up later as well. Selling cultivars of natives is pretty common in general nurseries and garden centers, but again, I did not record data for that. And these types of plant vendors are ubiquitous throughout the Midwest. Even things like Walmart or even many grocery stores, especially at this time of year, fall under this umbrella. So that is the first category that we will look at. The second are tree farms. Pretty straightforward. These are farms that produce woody species and use agricultural practices. So they're big fields full of rows of trees. And because of that, they are very easily visible from satellite. This is a tree farm outside of Springfield, Illinois, and you can actually see the rows of trees. And generally, these are quite large in scale, and they often don't have very much infrastructure, so there may not even be really buildings associated with the farm. It may just be a big field full of trees that are dug up and sold somewhere else. Tree farms tend to be very species poor. They typically only sell a couple dozen species of trees, and in the most extreme examples of that are Christmas tree farms, which sometimes do sell native plant species, native trees. And those did count in my sampling because some of them did sell native trees. And tree farms are frequent in the Midwest, particularly in rural areas. The third type of vendor are native plant nurseries. These are vendors that explicitly emphasize native plant biodiversity in their business model. And because of this, they do not sell non-natives, non-native meaning regional non-natives or things from Europe, and they typically never ever sell cultivars. And one of the main reasons that they don't sell these two really important things is because many native plant nurseries are kind of attached to the practice of ecological restoration. In other words, they are the suppliers of that activity. And likewise, they usually hold very high plant biodiversity relative to the other three vendor types. Native plant nurseries, I wouldn't call them rare, but they are occasional in the Midwest. And the upper Great Lakes is actually one of kind of the hotspots of native plant nurseries. So there's even one or a couple in Madison, I believe. The fourth type of vendor are others. These are vendors that do not neatly fit into the other three categories, and they often have very specialized markets. Often they fall into one of two categories, but what kind of brings them together, if you will, is that they often have a very limited market niche. So places that are specialty growers. So some plant vendors will only sell irises or iris cultivars. That would count. Some vendors only sell things for agroforestry. And then some vendors are online or mail order vendors. So typically the other category, they may not even have a real building or a retail area for people to go purchase plants. A lot of their sales are so limited, they have to be online or from a catalog. These are also occasional in the Midwest. So now let's compare the vendors. We have an overview on the four vendors that are in the Midwest. So now let's ask, how many plant species do these vendors sell? What types of plant materials are sold? And third, which vendors hold the most plant biodiversity? Probably already spoiled that. How many plant species did these vendors sell? I observed just shy of 1,300 plant species that were sold in at least one plant vendor, meaning approximately 44% of the plant species native to the Midwest are commercially available somewhere. And I italicize somewhere because just because it's available somewhere doesn't mean it is easily or readily available, right? It could be in a vendor several states away. But this is still answering that question of just give it to me, how many plant species are available? It is just shy of 1,300. And here is a cartoon representing what this looks like. We have the regional species pool, so pretend that these are all 2,900 of the plants found in the Midwest. And then some species make it and others don't, and then you are left with a smaller commercial species pool. These are the species that are available. That is this number here. So now I'm going to give a very detailed look at the commercial species pool. What I did after coming up with this number is I was really interested in comparing what I call conventional vendors to native plant vendors. Native plant vendors are interested in native plant biodiversity, and these other three vendor types, they may hold native plants, but they don't really care about that, like I said. They're just trying to sell plants to the general public or for landscaping or commercial uses. So after those four categories, I subdivided them again to native nursery and conventional. So conventional was the other three vendor types that weren't native plant nurseries. I then determined whether each plant species was exclusively found in a native nursery, can be sourced from both conventional and native plant vendors, or was exclusive to the conventional vendors only. So let's take a look at what that looks like. This is called a tree map. It is essentially a pie chart. You have a box, and pretend that this box is 2,900 species. We can see that over half of the species are commercially unavailable, so this is the part of the regional species pool that does not make it into the commercial plant trade. Then anything that is a blue box is in the commercial pool. So anything that is blue is commercially available. Non-exclusive species can be sourced in native plant nurseries or conventional vendors. These are the plants that are exclusively found in native plant nurseries, and that represents 15% of species. And then this small sliver here, these are species that are only found in conventional vendors. So what does this teach us? Well, if you combine non-exclusive, the dark blue, and this lighter blue, we actually see that 95% of the species that are available are found in native plant nurseries, a pretty overwhelming number. So that is this entire blue box minus this little sliver here. Native plant nurseries have all of those, so it is pretty substantial. Now, let's compare the species richness of these four vendor types. On the x-axis, we have the vendor type, and on the y-axis, we have species richness. And keep in mind that these numbers are transformed, they're squished, because some nurseries have so many species, I needed to keep the axis visible to the viewer. So as we go up here, that's close to 700, while this is 1 to 10. So just keep that in mind. These are essentially fancy box plots. We have the median, and then each dot is a single vendor. And on the top, we have significance codes. So if each plot has a different letter, that means they are significantly different. So what does this figure teach us? Look at native plant nurseries. They're way, way, way up here. They have significantly higher biodiversity species richness compared to the other three vendor types. Now I want to direct your attention to the general nurseries and garden centers. Typically, these have a couple dozen species or less, but there are some general nurseries and garden centers that are really, really species rich. These are often these massive wholesale operations that sell almost anything you can think of, including native plants, as well as cultivars and non-native species. So that is kind of these data points up here. Tree farms and the other vendors, they tend to be very species poor, typically only holding a dozen or so native species or less in many cases. As an adjunct of this study, of this process, where I sampled all these vendors, I also recorded the types of plant materials being sold. In other words, what form of the plant is being sold. And I have 5 that I recorded. These materials are important to record because different materials are better for different end uses. If you want to plant a pollinator garden in your backyard of a single species, having a species embedded in a seed mix that may take several years to mature is probably not the best situation. You would probably prefer to buy that as a potted plant. On the contrary, if you have a former agricultural field that is several acres large, putting pots to fill all that space in would be really expensive and burdensome. So I looked at 5. Potted plants, bare roots. These are dormant plants where all the soil is knocked off. They're often sold in big boxes or bags for mass plantings of woodlands or restorations. We have plugs or trays. These are similar to pots, but they're these smaller plants right here that are grown in these trays and have well-developed root systems and can be planted kind of on the medium scale, if you will, kind of like medium-sized projects. Then we have species sold as seed, individually seed, right? Like seed packets of a specific species. And finally, we have embedded within a seed mix. So these are the 5 that I looked for. And so now let's take a look at the number of materials sold between these vendor types once again. These are violin plots, and we know that the letters are associated with significance codes. And on the y-axis this time, we have the mean number of materials sold for each species. So it can range from 1 to theoretically 5, because I looked for 5 different things. So let's take a look at what we learned from this plot. Well, we can see that the vast majority of vendors are selling plants typically as only one type of material, and usually that is pots, right? Buying things in pots is kind of standard among the commercial plant trade. But look at native plant nurseries again. They are significantly higher than the other 3 vendor types. Often, native plant nurseries are selling things as pots, plugs, seed, or even within seed mixes, because again, native plant nurseries are tied to ecological restoration, which could be backyard plantings to massive, huge projects. Because of this, I think native nurseries, they have what I call this double whammy of biodiversity value. Not only do they sell more species than the other types of vendors, but they also hold more materials for different end uses for different types of projects and customer expectations. So that is kind of that double whammy, as I say. So let's talk about part one. We just overviewed the plant vendors of the Midwest, and we compared some of their differences with respect to biodiversity. So we looked at native plant nurseries, general nurseries and garden centers, tree farms, and other. Remember, too, that native plant nurseries were also compared to these three types that are considered more conventional. We learned that about 44% of species found in the Midwest can be sourced from the commercial plant trade, most of which are held in the native plant nurseries. And we finally learned that native nurseries are the most species rich and that they sell many different types of materials. So now for part two. We know what is available, so now let's take a look at commercial popularity or unpopularity. Of the available species, which species are the most commercially popular? And similarly, how many available species are frequent versus rare? And third, which vendors are holding the popular or unpopular species? I call this slide the dreaded right skew. This is a frequency histogram. On the x-axis, we have the frequency, the number of vendors a species was found in. And on the y-axis, we have the number of species. This is a very right-skewed distribution because there are very few plants that are found in a lot of nurseries. Reality, I think, is often very right-skewed. So think of income, right? Like these are the Jeff Bezos over here, or the Yankees, right? Like reality is not equal. Some things are very dominant or very frequent in their appearance. Similarly, the vast majority of available species are rarely encountered in the commercial trade. And actually, do you see this dotted blue line? This is the line that shows 30 vendors. So 80% of the species that are available are found in fewer than 30 plant vendors across the entire region. So that kind of represents the uncommon or unpopular or rare species in the commercial trade. So now we have this dreaded right skew, so let's ask, who are these hyper winners? Who are the most frequent plant species that you can find in the commercial plant trade? Especially these, right? These are the popular or winner species, as I said. These are typically plant species that break it into the conventional plant vendors. They typically fall into one of two categories. They are either generic shade trees. I call them generic shade trees because they're just trees that happen to be native and they grow and they provide shade. Or sometimes very showy prairie perennials. Showy prairie perennials, wow, that is a difficult thing to say. Showy prairie perennials are beloved for being easy to grow and very pretty in a garden. So they are sensible additions to landscaping and gardening contexts. Here are just 4 examples of some of the most frequently observed native plant species in the commercial plant trade. Note that these are showy and showy in their wild form, not as cultivars, and they are typically well behaved in cultivation. So we have species like butterfly milkweed. This was actually number 1. This was the winner of my study. Beloved for being electric orange and being very good for pollinators. Then we have our generic shade trees like white pine and redbud. Redbud might be flowering now. It also has like kind of the benefit of being very pretty in the spring. And then another popular species was prairie dropseed. I think this was number 9 or 10. This is the most frequently observed grass, and this is a prairie perennial, and it looks very nice. It's very stately in appearance, and it turns a pretty color in the fall. You will even see this species being grown in McDonald's parking lots. So that gives you an idea of how popular it is. Now let's ask the other question. Who are the victims? Who are the rare species in the commercial trade? Well, just as a general comment before I show some examples, These commercially rare species are really the ones that are only found in native plant nurseries. Many are what I call boutique species that are only admired by big plant nerds like myself, or restoration practitioners that have a high input project. So the demand for these species is typically much lower from these really showy, popular plants. And so now here's just an example of what that might look like. These are native species that are all available in the commercial trade. And typically, the less common species, they tend to be more specialized, and they tend to be, maybe you notice, a little less showy, a little weirder looking, maybe to the general public. So we have things like eelgrass or gray bog sedge. Sedges are a grass-like plant that are often very difficult to tell apart, even for very trained eyes. So a lot of people probably don't care so much for them. Then we have a species like tall green milkweed. And tall green milkweed is a prairie plant, but I think it looks not that attractive. That's not really scientific, but that's how I feel. And then we have something like blackjack oak. This is a native tree that is just kind of outcompeted by more stately and easier to grow oaks. So while this species is commercially available, it tends to be pretty rarely seen. So we just overviewed part 2. That was about commercial popularity of the available species. So what did we learn? Popular species tend to be these generic shade trees or showy perennials, often pretty prairie wildflowers. Unpopular species, they tend to be species that are restricted to native plant nurseries, and they're often or probably used in restoration contexts only. And when I say that too, that many restorations are not using a lot of these really boutique-y, weird species. They tend to be the higher-end restoration projects with a lot of money and a lot of interest from the practitioners running it. So now, let's move on to part 3, factors associated with commercial availability or not. We have a list of about 1,300 available species. Those were the blue species, right? And then 1,600 species that cannot be found, cannot be purchased. That's the gray. Remember the tree map? So, from these two lists, can we find out which types of species are more likely to be available or unavailable? And in order to answer this question, I use binary or binomial generalized linear models to find out. And this is a binary approach because a species is available or it is not. So let's take a look at the factors that I looked at that were predicted to associate with commercial availability. The first was whether a species was short or long-lived. Many short-lived species, like annual whitlow grass, they tend to be weedy things that may not capture the eye or the admiration of many people, so we kind of expected them to be poorly available. We also looked at growth form. In other words, what type of plant species is it? So here are the designations that we looked for. We looked at trees, shrubs, graminoids, meaning grass-like species, including sedges, vines, forbs. Forbs are the fleshy wildflower-like plants. And then lastly, ferns. I looked at 2 other factors, and these other factors aren't categories, but they are rather numeric in origin. I looked at the breadth of range. In other words, of the 7 study states, how many states can that species be found in? One would expect that a more widely distributed species in the Midwest is probably more likely to be available than something that is native to the deep southern tip of Illinois, and that's the only place it is found, right? So that is what we were looking for. And here is actually like a map of some of the data that we used. We have a plant species named compass plant, and this is a distribution map. So every state that is dark green means that that species is native to the state, and every yellow or light green county that is highlighted is where that plant species is known to occur. So in this instance, compass plant, I believe, is native to all 7 of the study states. Secondly, I looked at each species' coefficient of conservatism, also called a C-value. These are values ranging from 0 to 10 that reflect a species' tolerance to human disturbance. They are a loose proxy of ecological specialization. Species with low C values, such as wood sorrel, tend to be very weedy. Wood sorrel is a species that may be growing on a crack right outside of this building. On the contrary, species with high values, like white prairie orchid, these have C values of 10. If you see this species, you know that you are in somewhere very special, probably some type of nature preserve that is considered more pristine or has more historical ecological appearances. So we also looked at coefficients of conservatism. So now let's take a look at factors associated with poor or good commercial availability. So we looked at the different types of plant species and we looked at lifespan. So everything over here to the left are associated with bad or poor commercial availability, and over here are more likely to be available. Short lifespan, as expected, was way less commercially available than long-lived species. Similarly, species like ferns and graminoids tend to be pretty poorly available overall. This is actually related to ferns. This is called ground pine. It's a forest specialist species that is highly conservative and would be very difficult to grow. Then we have species like amaranths. These are annual weeds that infest crop fields. This is a type of species you would never ever want to purchase. And then you have something like spike sedge. I keep picking on the sedges. Sedges just don't look that showy to most people. They're just kind of these green, grassy things. So these are also species that tend to be pretty poorly available. Now, on the other hand, long-lived species and woody species. Woody species were the big winners of being more likely to be commercially available. So things like bur oak, a very majestic tree. That's one of the most commonly encountered species in the landscape. Shrubs like black chokeberry, or Virginia creeper, a native vine that is planted along fence lines. Now let's take a look at C values and state range. These figures are a little more abstract, but I'm going to hopefully explain them. On the y-axis in both plots, we have commercial availability. A species is unavailable, 0, or it is available, a 1. For each available species, you see a gold dot at 1. And each unavailable species, you see a black dot, meaning that you cannot purchase it. The green dots are averages, and then the black line is the predicted trend, the predicted proportion. And that's true for the state count figure as well. So let's see what we can learn. When you look across the C value axis, you see that commercial availability is lowest for the most and the least conservative species. In other words, commercial availability is maximized with species that kind of have these intermediate ecological tolerances. So in other words, these really weedy species are not sold, and then these species restricted to pristine habitats are not sold. So it's kind of this hump-shaped pattern. Now let's take a look at state counts. Ranges from 1 to 7. As state count increases, availability is predicted to increase, just as I expected, right? Species that are only available in one state may have very specialized growing conditions and may be less sought after for the public. So now let's overview part 3. We just learned that there are predictable traits associated with commercial availability. And there's kind of this emergent pattern that I implied and discussed earlier, is that ecological specialists or weedy plant species tend to be very poorly available and not available in the commercial trade. To reinforce this point, to reinforce all of this data, I have created a small thought experiment to think in the extremes of what I just discussed. So what would be the species that is the most likely to be commercially available? Well, this would be a long-lived, woody, tree-like species that's widespread and has intermediate ecological tolerances. A species that fits that description perfectly is river birch, which is, I think, the number 6 or number 7 most popular species in the commercial plant trade. So it kind of makes sense. Now let's think of the opposite. What is the species that you would expect to never find in the commercial trade? This would be a short-lived fern that's highly conservative and only native to maybe a single corner of a single study state, this would be the Pacific mosquito fern, which is not commercially available at all. So these are just two faces to some of these patterns that I've been discussing. So it's not just super abstract in nature. We've been talking a lot about availability, which begs the question, and I get asked this a lot, and this kind of veers into personal opinions and biases and attitudes instead of science, but I think it's important to talk about. What species should be commercially available? In my professional opinion, that's a really difficult answer, and it's variable, and it's something I'm interested in researching in the future. But it makes sense that there are just some species that will never be commercially available, especially problematic species and ubiquitous weeds. So here we have poison ivy. Why would you ever sell or grow poison ivy? That is ridiculous, that premise. And then we have the ragweeds. Ragweeds are found almost everywhere. Their seeds are in the soil. They can live for a really, really long time. And not only are they super weedy and everywhere and nasty looking, but they are one of the main causes of allergies, and specifically hay fever. So while they may not be as known as poison ivy, these are also public health hazards. Continuing this question of what species should be available, some species will simply never really have realistic demand due to their ecology. This applies to the extremely specialized plant species. I have two examples here. We have the orange fringe orchid and Indian pipe. These are really cool looking species, and as a quick aside, there are a lot of native orchid species, and many of them are quite beautiful. But the problem is, in both of these species, they have these really specialized soil conditions. Orange fringe orchid needs the presence of specific soil fungi in order to even germinate. And once it germinates, it may take a decade or decades to flower. Then you have Indian pipe. This is a parasitic plant that lives underground for almost its entire life cycle, and it requires these really nice forest ecosystems. With these two examples, you might imagine that these are really, really difficult to cultivate, if not impossible, for the commercial plant trade. And likewise, these species are not commercially available at all, and probably never will be, even if plant nerds like me would love to purchase one. So for some more factors of commercial unavailability, some species may simply be obscure to growers and consumers, even if they are good choices. Here, I give an example of this. We have purple coneflower, again, one of the most beloved native plants in the Midwest. Then we have yellow crownbeard. I give a minus to yellow crownbeard because it is not commercially popular and is not seen very often in the commercial plant trade. Yellow crownbeard, though, I think is a wonderful plant, and it has a lot of ecological similarities to purple coneflower. They bloom at roughly the same time, they attract similar pollinators, they are roughly the same size, and they have very similar habitat affinities. But there's just simply a more popular and easier alternative. And so I think yellow crownbeard gets kind of kicked to the curb just because there's just a better option available. Furthermore, there are a lot of these other species that are technically available in the commercial trade, but they are very underutilized and extremely rare. And as I've been discussing, many of these are probably just exiled from the commercial plant trade simply because there are better, perhaps cheaper options available, or options that maybe people think are just prettier, right? So now let's summarize my key findings. We have these three parts. For part one, these are just the bullet points of some of the most important things we've been learning. About 44% of native species in the Midwest can be sourced from commercial plant vendors. 2, native nurseries are the most species rich. They have a unique market type, and they hold the most plant materials. For part 2, popular available species tend to be these very showy prairie plants and shade trees. Unpopular plant species are almost always found in native plant nurseries and tend to be less showy. For part 3, we learned that there are factors that can help you predict commercial availability, which include lifespan, the growth form, the type of plants, range size, and ecological conservatism. So also, let's discuss the big picture of what all of this information means. I believe the Midwest, and I have data, has one of the most biodiverse commercial plant trades perhaps in the world. It is certainly, I would argue, one of the most developed places for selling and sourcing native plants from a commercial industry. We are one of the best places to be, especially due to these native plant nurseries, some of which are quite large. There's this advanced industry, as I say, of native nurseries, and they are banks of regional plant diversity. Not only do they hold these species, but they propagate them and grow them and spread them to new areas through their purchasers. And finally, many plant species are either entirely unavailable or commercially obscure. Again, those are those rare, unpopular species. So even if a species is available, keep in mind that it may be very difficult to source, and you may have to go looking very far away. As my last slide, as my final ending thoughts, I have 2 studies about this topic in Native Plants Journal and Ecological Restoration. Maybe I can talk to Tom about putting those online or something. That will give a lot more details about what I did, some of the nuances, and my information with respect to what this talk has covered. And this is just bias, but I really encourage people to visit their local or regional native plant nursery to learn about native plant biodiversity or to purchase them, because I believe, and I have done this at my own home, growing native plant species is an extremely rewarding and environmentally friendly action. It's been wonderful to grow these native species, including obscure ones. You get a sense of their character. You get to see them interacting with pollinators and other insects. It's a fun little hobby that I think is analogous to bird watching in a sense, but just at a smaller scale. So there are a lot of species out here. This is one of my favorite species. It's called royal catchfly. It's an endangered prairie plant, and it's hummingbird pollinated. So I just had a picture of that in my garden because I think it's very pretty. So that was the final note I wanted to end the talk on, to just help us think about this. But anyway, thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
All right, Mike.
You got his hand up.
Sorry about that.
Thanks. Yeah, I was curious, did you have much contact with these seed companies that are called, Savor Seeds or Heritage Seeds, the ones that specialize in different types of flowering or vegetable?
Heirloom vendors?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a wonderful, wow, and that's a very specific question. Those were looked at. I looked at everything I could find, and those often fell into that other category. But some of them had, actually, maybe I can go back to our plots. So with this other category, right, a lot of them are very species poor because they're heirloom garden vendors that may sell one native species or a few. But some heirloom seed vendors I ran into were very big, and that's these little data points. I think a couple of those are snuck into there, yes. So I did look at those. Did I personally interact or talk to them? Not really. A lot of these vendors just have their information online, so I just looked at their lists and recorded what I saw.
Are there any of the native plant species that are interdicted at a state level for agricultural reasons? Things like the dodder or other parasitic plants?
I'm so happy you asked that. I think the answer is yes. It's hard to say. Dodders are probably the best example, and I obviously put a picture of a dodder. Everybody, yeah, let me explain. So dodders are one of my favorite types of plant species out there.
What about the suns?
Right here. And these, what?
What about the suns?
Oh, okay, yeah, that's true. Need to be more egalitarian. This is daughter. It's an orange vine. This vine is a parasite, meaning it like attacks plants to get its energy. It really doesn't photosynthesize. These would be an example of a species that would be legally restricted, and then there are noxious weeds, which would probably encompass a lot of amaranths and like ragweeds. Dodder does break my heart that it would be considered illegal to sell, technically, just because it is ecologically valuable. And in my anecdotal experience, a lot of dodder species don't necessarily target agricultural species. There are some. But that is a wonderful technical question. And the answer is yes, there are probably a handful of species which would be restricted to sell. And these tend to be hazards to agriculture or human health. But for the majority of those cases, no one would ever sell them. I will tell you that I have seen dodders being sold before, but they were removed, probably because somebody said something. So dodders tend to be completely unavailable, even though I think they are very ecologically valuable. So, no, wonderful question.
It's ironic that the dodders are considered bad because they're parasites, but you also pointed out that some of the orchids
Yes.
Are also parasites, but we love them.
And when we think of parasites, just as a quick aside, we think of these nasty animals that we hate, like lice or flukes or something, right? But plant parasites are really cool because they actually promote more biodiversity. So in many cases, they will attack dominant plant species and knock them back a little to kind of level the playing field, if you will. And so the presence of parasites in restorations is kind of an emerging topic and considered a big deal because many restorations don't have that type of plant species present. Yeah, quick aside, I'm really glad you asked that. It's cool. And I got to nerd out about dodder. Yes?
Hi. When you're doing a prairie restoration, how many different species do you need in order to have a viable prairie?
That's a wonderful question, and I'm one of the best people to ask that ever. And I'm not trying to be like, oh, ho, ho, right? But I conducted a study about seed mixes, and that is my ecological restoration paper. And I can tell you this, and I'm conducting a study about prairie remnants. So the remnants are the remaining natural prairies that are left, so we can get a sense of what was there and how many species can be expected before everything happened. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about this. Prairie remnants are really, really biodiverse, like I said. They can easily have over 100 species. Some can have 300 or 400. Most seed mixes on the market, and I know this because I've studied it, most seed mixes on the market have anywhere from 15 to 35 species. Very low. However, I don't want to come up here and poo-poo the idea of restoration because for many restorations, you don't necessarily need to have everything there to have a very valuable habitat, right? And in many cases, if you are smart about species selection, 20 to 40 species can yield a prairie restoration that promotes pollinators or wildlife, right? Or kind of looks like a prairie. But for people who are snobs, I'm a little bit of a snob about that stuff, a lot of restorations fall short of what the best remaining natural areas look like. And again, I don't want to come across as too negative because having a restoration with that many species would be very difficult and very expensive because typically the more species you include, the more expensive it is and the more difficult sourcing those species becomes. So the answer is kind of mixed. I hope that's the synthesis of what I mean, that most prairie restorations aren't really that species rich, but not very biodiverse prairie restorations are still wonderful and still do good things.
Okay, when you have a prairie restoration, do native species tend to show up in that and it becomes more biodiverse as it goes along?
No, that's a wonderful question. And maybe this is me veering into the weeds because it's a wonderful question. No pun intended. So in Europe, they do a lot of grassland restorations. And many of these restorations in Europe are nearby these remaining natural grasslands. And so you have spillover, is what it's called. You have these species that are naturally recolonizing the restoration. And so in some cases, restorations can get these species from over here and increase over time. But consider the context of the American Midwest. Many restorations are kind of isolated from really nice natural areas, and there are very few of them. So over time, actually what happens for many restorations, and this includes not only prairie, but like wetland restorations, is that the species that naturally colonize are either European weeds or extremely weedy native species like ragweed or something, right? So that is true. Species can naturally colonize a restoration, but the nice ones that you really care about are only going to be colonizing under specific contexts. Hopefully that answers the question. Yes.
Here we go. Oh, I'm sorry, I saw Nancy. And 3, 2, 1.
Are there, are there better prairie to have around the house that the deer don't naturally eat? We
You know,
have
that's
quite
a wonder-
big
yeah,
problem
that-
with deer.
I have planted a couple native gardens. One I'm really proud of, I planted at my old university, which is infested with deer. I mean, herds of like dozens and dozens of deer. And something that I've learned, and it's very tragic in my heart, is that even plant species that are theoretically not good for deer, they will just bite and try. But I would say that mints, like things in the mint family or things that are poisonous like milkweed, may somewhat deter them. So things that are mints, there are several popular wild mints that are prairie plants. They're really nasty to eat in large amounts, so I would assume deer would not go after them. And then milkweeds are mildly poisonous to very poisonous. So deer may nibble on those, but they generally tend to stay away. Or really robust hairy species. So if you remember in one of my slides, I had compass plant. That's a plant that gets like 10 feet tall, and its root can go 20 feet down into the soil, basically. It's a massive, robust plant. And they're very like hairy and tough. And so once they get to adult size, I think deer tend to stay away. But are deer a problem in native gardening? If you have deer, yes, they can be, and it sucks. And I've experienced it.
Other questions?
I have a somewhat technical question.
Yes.
On that photo of a 12-year-old
Yes.
at that native species
Yeah,
place.
this guy.
Yeah, that guy was barefoot. So do you find that to be essential in your
I
study of the native plant species?
as a esoteric academic correction, I think I'm wearing sandals. Do you see that?
Now, it's hard to see.
It's hard to see. I think that's a sandal right here. See how
Okay,
the-
then I stand corrected.
Yeah. I will say, though, that wearing sandals whenever you're doing physical labor is not a good idea, and I have paid for that dearly before, with like getting cut or stepping on bees. Yeah.
That wins the award for one of the best questions ever asked in the 17 years.
Yeah.
of-
That's a
Wednesday night
very
at the
good
lab.
eye, yeah. I might have to censor that in the next talk.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, crop it out.
First of all, ILL,
Oh, I and I, yeah.
very good.
Yeah.
What do you feel about like Queen Anne's lace and fleabane and those sorts of weeds?
Sure.
Is that something to remove from a developing prairie, or what's your opinion on that?
Fleabanes are technically native, at least in Illinois, even though they are very weedy, and fleabanes would be a species that would naturally colonize, I think. I feel mixed about things like Queen Anne's lace and things like parsnip. And the reason is because a lot of these exotic species from Europe, they are invasive and they may take resources from native plants that are the targets, but some of them are relatively innocuous and some are extremely good for wildlife. So there's a study conducted by this guy named Robertson back nearly 100 years ago, and I think the results of his study, where he just went out and looked at plants, he found that I think parsnip and Queen Anne's lace support or are shown to have the most pollinators, or one of the most pollinator-rich plant species. So there are some weed species that are just straight up bad for a restoration. And then there are some that are, to me, a little more ambiguous, and it depends on your resources or your goals. And I've heard situations where Queen Anne's lace is a problem, and then I've seen restorations where it's just dotted around and, it's innocuous. I use that word a lot. So it varies, to answer your question. Same thing with fleabanes and Queen Anne's lace. They also thrive on disturbance. So they may pop up very early in a restoration, but with management and succession, they may gradually disappear.
All right, we have a question online.
Yes.
I have restored a prairie, but it's being overrun with Canadian goldenrod. How do I get rid of this invasive?
What is it that's being overrun?
Canadian goldenrod.
No, I know, but
Oh,
what's the...
the prairie.
Oh, prairie bean. Canadian goldenrod is a problem. It is a native species that is very invasive, and it actually is invasive in China, I believe. It's one of those North American species that does well transported other places. I've noticed that Canadian goldenrod tends to infest prairie restorations that have low grass cover. But to answer the question specifically, once it's already established, you could try and target herbicides. You can try and use hemiparasites to knock it back. I would specifically look into lousewort or wood betony. That's an emerging parasitic species that I think can hit back against the goldenrod. But goldenrod is a problem, and that is not my forte, like with the practical restoration management. And I know that it is a problem, and that herbicide is often what I see managers using when it becomes really, really bad.
Jack, what was that, lousewort?
Yes.
And the other word you used?
Wood betony.
What are those?
Pedicularis canadensis. That is a
that cleared me up.
hemiparasite. Yes.
And what is a hemiparasite?
Hemi is like half, right? So lousewort is a species that blooms in the early spring, and it has these roots that attack other roots, and it will suck up nutrients and water, but it also photosynthesizes. So it's like a sort of parasite, where it's stealing nutrients and vitamins and minerals and water, but it can still make its own food. Compared to dodder. Dodder is fully parasitic. It has to latch onto something to survive. That's the difference, and that's a technicality that's in very deep restoration, yeah.
Mike?
And I don't want to keep anybody, but anything else?
Thanks. Yeah, just a quick question. I was curious specifically about a pink or yellow lady slipper.
Mm-hmm.
Where would those fit on the scale of either commercial availability or desirability by
That's a great
planters?
question. So the lady slipper orchids are these beautiful orchids. They're very showy and very bizarre. I think they're like borderline alien looking, but kind of in a good way. And one would predict that those would be completely unavailable due to their specialized ecology, but I will say that there are nurseries that specialize in growing them. And I think a handful of orchids that I found were lady slippers. And I'm not sure if those were cultivated or dug up from the wild, but I know that there is a nursery that I found that specialized in growing lady slippers orchids. But there are more orchids out there than just the lady slippers orchids. It's fairly diverse. And really, those are the only ones that you have a hope of getting your hands on.
They're protected, aren't they, the lady slippers?
I think they might be. It may vary state to state. I'm not sure about the nuances because if anybody catches on, like from my talk, I think of everything, right? Yeah. And there's a lot of these really cool stories underneath, like the slipper orchids, where, yeah. As a quick note, too, some plant species are theoretically protected by Endangered Species Acts, but I've noticed that people sell things anyway. Even federally listed things I've seen before, just being sold in the commercial trade. And I feel very mixed about that. Actually, I tend to be pretty positive about it. As long as these nurseries aren't hurting wild populations, I don't really see the problem. I think it gives people, a sense of, ooh, cool, the species, I'm helping, yes. Yes, sorry.
You mentioned the UW Arboretum. Are you familiar with their annual plant sale? And what contribution does that have to diversity?
I actually just saw a sign that that sale was going on, I think this weekend. And there are a lot of these small native plant sales, and I think that is wonderful. I think it is growing in importance, and I'm seeing it more frequently around. And anecdotally, the native plant sales that I know of in central Illinois, I'm told that they get bigger every year. That's really important for turning urban areas and suburban areas into little pockets or islands of biodiversity for things like pollinators and other insects. So I think that is really important too, that when you're thinking about plant biodiversity, it doesn't have to be huge. It can be a local action. And these small native plant sales from different organizations are great. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Oh, well, let me bring the microphone down to you.
Well, I've never had a problem being heard.
Yeah, but they can't hear you on the Zoom.
I was wondering about native medicines and things like that. In this array of stuff you've presented, are there any such things?
I know that Native Americans use some of these native plants for a variety of different things, but I don't know much about that personally. I would look that up online. Yeah, I do know that some have like alleged medical uses, but I'm not 100% sure. And I couldn't summarize that really well like I can about like seed mixes. That's just more something where I'm like, yes, many native plant species had some use for Native Americans, whether it was some ailment or some physical resource.
The native plant sale for the Friends of the Arboretum is actually May 20th, 2023. I thought it was May 2nd. I'm the one that said to you, oh, look, it's coming up, and I was wrong.
I was lied to, yeah.
I was wrong. So May 20th, 2023, early shopping for Friends starts at 9 a.m., general public from 10 a.m. until the plants sell out. So that's, I'm looking at the Friends of the Arboretum website to confirm that date. Thank you very much. This is fabulous. Really appreciate that.